There are some moments that do not begin with a declaration of war, a siren, or a televised emergency address. They begin with a silence so heavy that the people in power stop speaking in public because they are still trying to understand what just changed. And if the reports circulating through Washington, Jerusalem, Moscow, and Tehran are even partially accurate, then that is exactly the kind of moment we are sitting in right now. Because this is not just another missile story. This is not just another Iran headline. And this is definitely not one more recycled panic cycle designed to get clicks for 24 hours and then disappear. What makes this different is the possibility that the line separating conventional escalation from civilization-level deterrence may have just been crossed in the Middle East in a way that cannot be easily reversed. If even part of this transfer story is true, then we are no longer talking about Iran as a state slowly inching towards some distant threshold. We are talking about the possibility that Iran has now moved much closer to a ready-made strategic capability through Russian help. Whether that means a complete warhead, design architecture, key components, or re-entry technology. And every one of those possibilities changes the map. Now, just before we go deeper, YouTube tells me a huge number of people who watch these videos still have not subscribed yet. So if you get value from this content, subscribe right now and comment Professor below so I know you are part of this community. And while you are down there, check the description too, because I've left bonus links for you there, including the premium WhatsApp channel and the membership link if you want deeper research and extra updates beyond the public videos. So, jumping in, here is what makes this story so dangerous. The loudest version of the claim says Iran has received something linked to Russia's RS-28 Sarmat, the system widely known in Western media as Satan-2. That title alone is enough to trigger fear, but fear without analysis is useless. What matters is not the nickname. What matters is the strategic logic behind the weapon, the timing of any alleged transfer, and the reason Washington suddenly looks like it is trying to speak carefully while thinking very fast. Because people hear a phrase like Satan-2 Warhead and immediately imagine one simple conclusion: Iran can now push a button tomorrow and end the game. I think that is too simplistic, and it is the first place where I want to challenge the panic narrative. A transfer of technology, components, or design data is not the same thing as an instantly operational plug-and-play superweapon. Integration matters. Delivery systems matter. Command and control matters. Training matters. Survivability matters. The difference between possession and usable deployment is where serious analysis begins. That said, this is still not a small story. In fact, even the more cautious version is enormous. Because if Russia really crossed the line from strategic partnership into direct transfer of warhead-related capability to Iran, then the old rules that govern nuclear restraint look weaker tonight than they did yesterday. And once those rules start to look weak, every regional rival begins recalculating. Let us start with the weapon system at the center of this conversation. The Sarmat was designed as a heavy intercontinental ballistic missile intended to replace older Soviet-era systems. Russia has repeatedly presented it as one of the crown jewels of its strategic deterrent, though Reuters reported in late 2024 that Moscow was still working to place the Sarmat on full combat duty, which matters because it suggests even Russia's own deployment track has had friction. That alone should make viewers more careful about accepting the most theatrical version of the story. If a system is still facing rollout challenges in its home arsenal, then the idea of a perfect immediate transfer to another state deserves skepticism. But skepticism should not become complacency. A delayed or partial transfer can still be enough to alter the military balance, especially if it closes the exact technical gaps Iran has struggled with for years. And those gaps are not imaginary. The reason nuclear programs are so difficult is not only fissile material, it is miniaturization, it is re-entry, it is fusing, it is heat shielding, it is hardening. It is making sure a device survives launch stress, atmospheric re-entry, and terminal delivery. That is where outside assistance matters most. A country does not need to import an entire doomsday package to gain a giant strategic leap. Sometimes a few missing engineering pieces change everything. Now layer that on top of the most recent public data around Iran's nuclear file. Reuters reported, citing the IAEA, that before the 2025 strikes, Iran had 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. And the agency's benchmark suggests that if enriched further, that amount could be enough for around 10 nuclear weapons. Reuters also reported that much of that material was believed to remain tied to or near hardened facilities in Isfahan, with inspectors still lacking the access they want. That is one of the most important fresh facts missing from most emotional coverage. The danger is not just one alleged transfer. The danger is an alleged transfer landing in an environment where Iran already had a troubling enrichment position, hardened infrastructure, and a long record of adapting under sanctions and military pressure. When you combine an advanced indigenous base with imported strategic know-how, timelines compress. And that is why this story is bigger than a single aircraft, a single convoy, or a single intelligence leak. The real issue is whether Russia decided that helping Iran become much harder to coerce now serves Moscow's interests more than preserving any remaining appearance of restraint. If that answer is yes, then every future crisis around Israel, the Gulf, and even US force posture changes with it. Now, let me explain the part a lot of people are not saying clearly enough. The old non-proliferation bargain was never based on trust alone. It was based on the idea that the recognized nuclear powers would at least maintain a formal red line against transferring nuclear weapons or directly helping non-nuclear states acquire them. The UN treaty text says, nuclear weapon states undertake not to transfer nuclear weapons or assist non-nuclear states in acquiring them. And the IAEA still describes that principle as central to the global regime. So if a permanent UN Security Council member really helped move Iran across that line, even indirectly, then the damage is not only military, it is institutional. It tells every middle power that the rule book is not dead on paper yet, but in practice, it can be bent when great powers believe the payoff is high enough. And once that lesson spreads, the next decade becomes much more dangerous. Now here's the second point that needs serious attention. This alleged transfer did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged in a world where the United States and Russia already see each other through the lens of accumulated grievance, proxy war, sanctions, and strategic signaling. From Moscow's perspective, Washington armed Ukraine for years, expanded military support networks around Russia, and treated escalation as acceptable as long as it served Western priorities. That does not make a transfer lawful or wise, but it does help explain how the Kremlin may be framing it internally. Because Putin's calculation, if this is what happened, is not emotional. It is transactional. He may believe that America and Israel have already normalized direct pressure on states aligned with Russia. So Russia is now normalizing a much darker kind of answer. Not because it wants immediate nuclear war, but because it wants to make future intervention so expensive that Washington hesitates next time. And that, more than the dramatic headlines, is why this moment matters. Great powers do not need to launch at each other to destabilize the world. Sometimes it is enough for one of them to reposition risk. If Russia can make Iran dramatically harder to hit, harder to intimidate, and harder to isolate, it changes decisions in Jerusalem, in Riyadh, in Ankara, and in every naval headquarters watching the Gulf. By the way, if any of you watching have built something meaningful in your own life, business, career, education, whatever it is, share that success in the comments once in a while. It genuinely helps other people here who are trying to stay disciplined and move forward, and communities get stronger when ambition becomes visible. Now, let us talk specifically about Israel, because that is where the emotional center of this story sits. Israel is a small state in geographic terms, heavily urbanized, highly networked, and deeply dependent on fast layered defense. Its strategic doctrine has always relied on three things: superior intelligence, rapid preemption when necessary, and the belief that no enemy can strike it at existential scale without paying an unbearable price in return. But what if an adversary reaches a level where the return strike is no longer the only variable? What if the opening blow itself becomes more credible, more survivable, more ambiguous, and more difficult to intercept? Then deterrence starts changing shape. Not collapsing overnight, but becoming less comfortable, less stable, and more dependent on split-second judgment. Israel does possess formidable missile defense layers, and the Arrow family exists for exactly these kinds of high-end threats. Arrow 3 has also become strategically important enough that Germany expanded its contracts for the system to record levels, underscoring how seriously advanced ballistic threats are now being taken in Europe as well. But here's the hard truth: missile defense is not magic. It is economics, geometry, speed, inventory, and probability. The Wall Street Journal reported only days ago that Israel approved measures to boost interceptor production because stocks have been under strain, and that is another fresh reminder that even outstanding defense systems are finite when conflicts stretch and threats multiply. That matters because deterrence is not only about whether an interceptor can hit. It is about how many incoming objects must be tracked, how fast they arrive, whether decoys are involved, whether maneuvering is involved, and whether the defender has enough shots available over time. One missile may be interceptable. A coordinated saturation environment is a different conversation entirely. So the real Israeli concern is not a Hollywood scenario where one nickname ends civilization in 6 minutes. The real concern is that any Russian assistance could help Iran create a more survivable, more advanced, more coercive deterrent umbrella under which it can take bolder regional actions. That could include harder nuclear breakout bargaining, more confident missile signaling, or a stronger belief that Washington and Jerusalem will think twice before striking again. And once an adversary feels harder to punish, escalation becomes more unpredictable. That is the entire problem. Now turn to Washington. A lot of viewers keep asking the same question. If this is truly so serious, why does the American response sound so measured? Why not immediate ultimatums? Why not a dramatic global coalition? Why not the kind of full spectrum language we usually hear when proliferation fears spike? The answer is brutal. Because the menu of clean options is extremely small. A direct military strike is easy to say and very hard to execute when you are not fully certain what was transferred, where it is stored, whether it has been dispersed, and whether it is sitting inside hardened or deeply buried sites. The deeper the uncertainty, the riskier the strike. And the risk is not only operational failure. The risk is triggering a wider confrontation while still not removing the capability. A direct confrontation with Russia is even worse. Russia and the United States still hold almost 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, according to SIPRI's 2025 yearbook summary, and both continue modernizing their arsenals. That is why even furious rhetoric has a ceiling. Nobody in Washington wants a crisis over Iran to mutate into a direct US-Russia strategic showdown. So America is pulled into a deeply uncomfortable posture. It wants to show resolve without cornering itself. It wants to reassure Israel without promising what it cannot instantly deliver. It wants to warn Iran without creating the impression that Washington is about to make a move it may not actually make. And when great powers speak carefully, it is usually because the room behind the cameras is full of bad options. That is also why the alliance dimension matters more than many people realize. Reuters reported today that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has been pressing allies over Hormuz-related commitments, while Germany's Friedrich Merz publicly emphasized that NATO must not split over the US-Iran war. At the same time, France announced a major defense expansion that includes additional emphasis on nuclear deterrence and missile defense. Those are not isolated headlines. They are connected signals. Europe is looking at the Middle East crisis, at US political volatility, at Russia's behavior, and at the stress placed on missile defense inventories, and it is asking a bigger question. What does credible deterrence look like in a world where the old assumptions are eroding? That question is not abstract anymore. It affects defense budgets, force posture, industrial production, and long-term alliance planning. It also means this Iran story is no longer just a regional flashpoint. It is becoming one more pressure test on the Atlantic security system. And here's where I wanted to push back on another easy narrative. Some commentators are saying America has no answer at all. I do not think that is fully correct. America has answers. What it may not have is a satisfying answer that is fast, low risk, and guaranteed to work. Those are different things. The United States still has surveillance dominance, long-range strike capability, cyber capability, covert disruption tools, sanctions leverage, naval power, and alliance pressure points. What it does not have is a neat button that restores the old world after a transfer like this. That is why the response feels slow. Strategic repair always moves more slowly than strategic shock. So the issue now is not whether Washington can respond in some form. It is whether any response can restore deterrence quickly enough to matter. That is a much harder problem. Now let us talk about Iran's perspective, because that is another area where people keep simplifying. Tehran has spent decades learning one central lesson. If you cannot match the United States or Israel conventionally, then you build layers of deterrence through missiles, proxies, hardened sites, dispersal, ambiguity, and political endurance. You make yourself costly to break. If Russian help has now accelerated any part of that ladder, Iran's leadership will view it not simply as a weapon acquisition, but as strategic insulation. Insulation against coercion. Insulation against regime collapse planning. Insulation against the fear that one shock campaign can erase years of military investment. That does not mean Iran becomes invincible. It does mean Iran may feel less vulnerable than before, and that perception alone can alter behavior. States do not need perfect strength to act differently. They only need enough confidence that the balance has shifted. And this is where the market, energy, and geopolitical side comes in. Because yes, this story is also about missiles, but it is not only about missiles. It is about choke points, insurance premiums, naval escort burdens, energy supply expectations, and the psychology of risk pricing. When the Gulf becomes strategically unstable, oil does not only react to actual disruption, it reacts to expected disruption. That is part of why what happens next around Hormuz matters so much. Reuters reported today that European governments are working through military and diplomatic options tied to reopening or securing the strait. But even those conversations remain linked to broader ceasefire and negotiation questions. So the next phase is not just does Iran have more capability. The next phase is how does everyone around Iran behave now that they think Iran may have more capability? And that second question often moves markets faster than the first. If shipping risk rises, insurers react. If insurers react, costs rise. If costs rise, importers react. If importers react, governments react. If governments react, military deployments shift. This is how strategic shocks spread far beyond the place where they began. And that is why a lot of public discussion misses the chain reaction. People focus on the Warhead headline and ignore the fact that deterrence changes can ripple through alliance politics, energy security, military production, commodity pricing, and domestic political pressure inside democracies already exhausted by crisis after crisis. Now here is another fresh fact worth adding to the analysis. Reuters reported just yesterday that France plans an additional 36 billion euros for rearmament by 2030, with attention to munitions, missile defense, and its nuclear deterrent. That tells you how fast major states are shifting from peace structure thinking to durability thinking. When countries start spending like that, it means they are not assuming this crisis architecture goes away soon. They are preparing for a long period in which missile defense, strategic warning, force protection, and deterrence signaling become normal policy rather than emergency policy. And yes, that should concern you because long confrontations create more chances for miscalculation than short confrontations do. Now, let us deal with the single biggest psychological fear at the center of this video title, the 24 hours frame. I understand why it grabs attention, it creates urgency. It tells viewers the clock is running, but I want to be careful here. The more realistic danger is not that Israel literally has one day before the sky falls. The more realistic danger is that decision windows are shrinking, ambiguity is growing, and both sides may now believe speed favors them more than patience does. That is the real danger of a crisis like this. Compression. Compressed warning time. Compressed diplomacy. Compressed decision-making. Compressed room for error. And when a crisis compresses, bad assumptions become more dangerous than bad weapons. This is also why intelligence quality matters so much. If Washington and Jerusalem are acting on multiple streams that point toward a transfer, they still have to distinguish among full warhead movement, component transfer, design transfer, and deception. Each one implies a different timeline. Each one implies a different policy response. And if policymakers get that wrong, they can overreact into disaster or underreact into strategic surprise. So my skeptical view is not that the threat is fake. My skeptical view is that the loudest version of the threat may not be the most analytically useful version. The smarter question is not, did Iran instantly become unstoppable? The smarter question is, what exact capability was transferred, what timeline did it shorten, and how does that alter coercion from this point forward? That is a much harder question. It is also the only one worth asking. And by the way, this is exactly why we have members-only videos now. A separate team is working behind the scenes on deeper research pieces, not recycled uploads, and those videos go much further into timelines, military logic, documents, and hidden second-order effects. If you want access to that side of the work, hit the join button or use the membership link in the description. Now, if we zoom out even further, the biggest story may be the precedent rather than the payload, because the nuclear order was always held together by unequal rules backed by mutual fear. Some states could have these weapons, most could not. The bargain survived not because everybody liked it, but because enough governments believed violating it would create a world worse than the one they already had. But if major powers now conclude that indirect transfer, technical assistance, and proxy deterrence are all acceptable tools under the right circumstances, then the incentives for restraint start eroding everywhere else. Think about what Saudi Arabia sees. Think about what Turkey sees. Think about what Egypt sees. Think about what East Asian states watch when they study how security guarantees perform under stress. Once they believe the old barriers are weakening, their internal debates change. Not publicly at first, quietly, bureaucratically, strategically, but they change. And once those debates start, the world does not become more stable. It becomes more crowded with threshold states, latent capabilities, covert procurement networks, missile defense races, and hair-trigger politics. This is how proliferation really accelerates. Not in one movie scene, but in a series of elite recalculations. Now add one more layer. The United States is not managing this story from a position of infinite political calm. President Trump's team has to project strength while also avoiding a situation where any next move looks like a forced admission that previous action failed to solve the problem. That creates pressure on messaging. The administration needs to look dominant while operating in a landscape where dominance is harder to prove. And when leaders are trapped between image and reality, communication often becomes a signal in itself. Every phrase is weighed, every silence is interpreted, every delay becomes a rumor. That is where media ecosystems can make things worse, because public narratives start splitting into two useless extremes. One side says nothing important happened, move on. The other side says the end is here tomorrow morning. Serious analysis lives in the uncomfortable space between them. In that space, this is what we can say. First, public reporting confirms Iran's nuclear file remained dangerous even before this latest transfer narrative, with major unresolved questions around enriched material and inspection access. Second, public reporting confirms the broader strategic environment is already stressed, with NATO, Europe, and major defense planners reacting in real time to alliance strain, Hormuz vulnerability, and the need for more missile defense and rearmament. Third, public reporting confirms Russia's Sarmat itself has remained important but not frictionless in deployment, which supports the argument that the exact nature of any alleged transfer matters enormously and should not be flattened into clickbait certainty. That combination tells us something essential. Even if the most dramatic version of the story is overstated, the strategic trend is still dark. Iran is still dangerous. Russia is still willing to create new headaches for the West. Europe is still nervous. Missile defense is still under pressure. And the global nuclear framework is still looking more fragile than it did even a year ago. That is enough reason to take this seriously without losing analytical discipline. Now let me tell you what I think Putin may actually be doing if this transfer happened in any meaningful form. I do not think the primary objective is merely helping Iran win a single confrontation. I think the deeper objective is to prove that Russia can still redraw the cost of Western intervention outside Europe. In other words, if the West can stretch Russian risk by supporting Russian adversaries, Russia can stretch Western risk by hardening Western adversaries. It is mirrored coercion. And mirrored coercion is dangerous because each side can justify it as a response rather than an initiation. That is how escalatory ladders get built, while both parties insist they are only answering what came before. Now what happens next? I think there are three broad paths. The first is the pressure path. Washington, Israel, and allied intelligence services intensify covert, cyber, diplomatic, and industrial disruption efforts designed to delay integration, identify storage sites, disrupt component matching, and force Iran into a defensive crouch before any newly gained advantage becomes operational. This is the least theatrical path and probably the most likely in the near term because it offers action without immediate overt escalation. The second is the deterrence path. More missile defense transfers, more naval concentration, more public-private intelligence cooperation, more visible strategic messaging to Iran and Russia that any move toward assembly or deployment will trigger consequences. This path is about stabilizing perception rather than rolling back reality. The third is the panic path. Somebody decides the timeline is too short, the evidence is too convincing, and the risk of waiting is greater than the risk of escalation. If that path opens, the region moves very quickly from strategic anxiety to direct crisis. And once direct crisis begins under nuclear ambiguity, control becomes much harder than people imagine. Personally, I think we are somewhere between the first and second path tonight. But the problem is that all it takes is one intelligence update, one satellite read, one intercepted conversation, or one movement into a hardened facility to push leaders toward the third. So yes, the next 24 hours matter, but not because an apocalyptic countdown in a title automatically becomes reality. They matter because these are the hours when governments decide whether they think they still have time. That distinction is everything. And whatever time you are watching this, tell me in the comments. As I am recording this, it is Thursday, April 9th, 2026, 8:59 p.m. in Pakistan, and I want to know what time it is where you are and whether you think the panic around this story is justified or exaggerated. Also tell me this. Do you think Russia's alleged move, if confirmed, was mainly about protecting Iran, humiliating Washington, or warning every U.S. 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 Washington, or warning every alley that the old security architecture is breaking down. I want to hear where you stand because the answer to that question tells us a lot about what you think comes next. And if you are one of the people doing well right now in your studies, your business, your work, your discipline, share a little of that in the comments too. You'll be surprised how much one honest success story can lift the morale of somebody else who has been struggling quietly. Now, as we close this out, let me leave you with the clearest bottom line I can give. The scariest interpretation of this story may not yet be fully proven in public. But the comfortable interpretation is gone as well. The combination of Iran's unresolved nuclear position, Russia's willingness to increase strategic pressure, strained missile defense inventories, fresh European rearmament signals, and alliance anxiety around Hormuz all point in the same direction. The world is moving into a more dangerous deterrence era, not a safer one. That means viewers should avoid two mistakes. Do not dismiss this as pure propaganda. And do not accept the most dramatic version without asking what exact capability changed, what timeline shifted, and who benefits from amplifying fear faster than facts can move. Because in moments like this, the people who stay calm do not do it by pretending nothing is wrong. They do it by seeing clearly. So watch the next signals carefully. Watch Isfahan. Watch Russian-Iranian military traffic. Watch how aggressive or restrained American language becomes. Watch whether Europe talks more openly about strategic autonomy. Watch missile defense production. Watch shipping risk in the Gulf. And above all, watch whether this story starts producing policy changes rather than just media noise. That is how you tell whether a headline has crossed into history. If you got value from this, subscribe, stay close, and check those links in the description for the premium WhatsApp channel, the membership option, and the bonus material. This channel is built for people who want more than surface level outrage, and I appreciate every one of you helping push that work forward. And as always, this is for educational and analytical purposes only. It is not financial advice, not military advice, and not a claim that any unverified intelligence report should be treated as confirmed fact before governments publicly establish it. It is a structured reading of a fast-moving situation, and in a situation like this, disciplined thinking matters more than panic. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will see you in the next one.